Chapter 7, Section 5, Reversing Reconstruction. The South's experiment with Reconstruction governments was short. Thomas Miller, a black lawmaker in South Carolina, would later recall, "We were 8 years in power. We had built schoolhouses, established charitable institutions, built and maintained the penitentiary system, provided for the education of the deaf and dumb, rebuilt the bridges and reestablished the ferries. In short, we had reconstructed the state and placed it on the road to prosperity." Thomas Miller. Former Confederates, however, saw this period of biracial government quite differently. For them, it was a time of struggle to return the South to white man's rule. White resistance to Reconstruction. Most Southern whites refused to support Reconstruction governments for a number of reasons. Many considered the governments illegal, because so many former Confederates had been prevented from voting or running for office. Others were angry at the governments for raising taxes to pay for schools and other improvements. Some had even lost their land when they were unable to pay taxes on it. Still others were upset by the corruption in the new governments. Underlying all these complaints was the fact that most Southern whites could not accept the idea of former slaves voting and holding office. Many were white supremacists who believed in the superiority of the white race. The most radical turned to violence, forming terrorist groups with names like the White Brotherhood and the Knights of the White Camellia. Members of the best-known terror groups, the Ku Klux Klan, had to swear that they were opposed to Negro equality, both social and political. These groups terrorized blacks and white Republicans to keep them from voting. Their tactics included the burning of African American schools, attacks on Freedmen's Bureau officials, and even outright murder. Northerners grow tired of Reconstruction. In 1870 and 1871, Congress took action to end the wave of terror by passing the Enforcement Acts. These laws made it a federal crime to deprive citizens of their civil rights. President Grant sent federal marshals into the South to crush the terror groups. These officials arrested hundreds of men and sent a few to prison. The result was a temporary reduction in terrorism. After passage of the Enforcement Acts, however, Northerners seemed to lose interest in Reconstruction in the South. In 1872, Congress closed the Freedmen's Bureau. That same year, it passed an Amnesty Act. This act granted amnesty or general pardon to most former Confederates, allowing them to vote and hold office once again. Even President Grant had grown tired of the South and its problems. In 1875, the governor of Mississippi asked Grant for help in protecting freedmen's voting rights during the state's November election. Grant refused the request by saying, "The whole public are tired out with these annual autumnal outbreaks in the South." By this time, Grant had other things to worry about. Leading members of his administration had been accused of corruption. The economy had crashed. Moreover, a new generation of Republican leaders had come to power and recognized that voters in the North no longer cared about Reconstruction. The election of 1876 brings an end to Reconstruction. President Grant did not run for re-election in 1876. Instead, the Republicans nominated Ohio's Rutherford B. Hayes, a former Union general. The Democratic candidate for president was New York Governor Samuel Tilden, a crusader for clean government. Tilden won the popular vote, but his 184 electoral votes were one shy of the 185 needed to win. The electoral votes of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana were disputed. Republican leaders claimed that Hayes won the most votes in those states. Democrats said Tilden won more votes. With no clear resolution, the election went to the House of Representatives. After weeks of secret dealing, leaders of both parties in the House arrived at an agreement known as the Compromise of 1877. Under this agreement, Hayes received the electoral votes from the three disputed states and became president. In return, he agreed to name a Southerner to his cabinet, remove the last remaining federal troops from the South, and give federal aid to Southern railroad construction. Much of the deal fell apart after Hayes took office, but the troops were removed and Reconstruction was officially over. African Americans lose ground under Redeemer governments. By the time Reconstruction ended, white supremacists calling themselves Redeemers had regained power in every Southern state. Their goal was to redeem or save the South by returning it to white man's rule. The whole South, commented a freedman, had got into the hands of the very men who held us as slaves. Once in office, the Redeemers reversed improvements made in education by cutting spending for public schools. As the governor of Virginia explained, schools are a luxury, to be paid for, like any luxury, by the people who wish their benefits. As public funding dried up, schools either closed their doors or began to charge fees. By the 1880s, only about half of all black children in the South attended school. The Redeemers put even more effort into reversing the political gains made by freedmen during Reconstruction. Many states passed laws requiring citizens who wanted to vote to pay a poll tax. The tax was set high enough to make voting, like schooling, a luxury most blacks could not afford. Some states also required potential voters to pass a literacy test. The tests were made so difficult that almost nobody could pass, no matter how well educated. In theory, poll taxes and literacy tests applied equally to both black and white citizens, as required by the 15th Amendment. In practice, however, whites were excused from both by a grandfather clause inserted in voting laws. This clause exempted citizens whose ancestors had voted before January 1, 1867. Because no African Americans could vote in the South before that day, the grandfather clause applied only to whites. The Redeemer governments also reversed laws that had outlawed segregation in public places. New legislation drew a color line between blacks and whites in public life. Whites called these new acts Jim Crow laws, an insulting reference to a black character in a popular song. African Americans were not allowed to sit with whites in buses or rail cars. Restaurants and other businesses served whites only or served black customers separately. These were just a few of the examples of how blacks were discriminated against. African Americans struggled to protect their rights. Blacks resisted attacks on their rights in many ways. The boldest protested openly, but this put them at risk of being lynched, killed by hanging, by white mobs. Homer Plessy, a black man arrested for sitting in a whites-only railroad car in Louisiana, looked to the courts for help. Plessy argued that Jim Crow laws violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In 1896, this case, Plessy v. Ferguson, reached the Supreme Court. The majority of justices ruled that segregation was constitutional as long as the facilities provided to blacks were equal to those provided to whites. This separate but equal doctrine was soon applied to almost every aspect of life in the South. However, the facilities set apart for African Americans in southern states were seldom equal to those labeled whites only. Some African Americans chose to move to the North rather than endure the humiliation of forced segregation. Most African Americans, however, remained in the South and got by as best they could. With participation in politics closed to them, they focused on their families, churches, and communities. The majority farmed for a living, often as sharecroppers or tenant farmers. A growing number of African Americans started their own businesses. The number of black-owned businesses in the South soared from 2,000 in 1865 to nearly 25,000 by 1903. African Americans also banded together to build schools and colleges for their children. By 1900, more than 1.5 million black children were attending school. As a result, literacy rates for Southern blacks rose from near 0 to 50%. The South's new black colleges afforded vocational training in such fields as farming and carpentry, as well as professional training in law, medicine, and teaching. For the next half-century, segregation would rule life in the South. But the 14th and 15th Amendments, with their promise of equal rights, were not completely forgotten. In time, they would be reawakened as part of a new struggle for racial equality.